Hello friends. For today's video, I wanted to go through some Goodreads snubs that I actually think make sense. So to further elaborate on that, because I know it seems kind of counterintuitive to put snubs and make sense together, these are ones that I would have liked to have seen on the nominations, but reflecting on it, I actually think that there are some pretty legitimate reasons why they're not there, or maybe they're not legitimate and I just think it makes sense. There's also some things I wanted to touch on having to do with the eligibility that I did not see mentioned, but I think there's an implication of something, and we'll get into that as we discuss the books. But I'm going to start with one that, when I first looked at the nominees, I was so sad that this book was not on the list, but I understand, and that would be Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. I loved this book. It was my favorite of Sanderson's secret projects, and it's not just of his secret projects. I actually think this is one of my favorite Sanderson books. I have such an enormous bias toward it, though, because I'm a huge fan, as many of you know, of the video game Final Fantasy X, and to see something that had some inspirations taken from that game was so delightful for me. It just made me feel so nostalgic and cozy, that wonderful feeling you get when you find something that reminds you of a story you loved as a child. So I have just adored this book. I thought it was precious. I loved the characters. I thought the world was really interesting, and it makes me very excited for more fantasy settings that are not your traditional sort of sword and sorcery medieval feeling. This one really showed what sci fantasy can be, so I really adored it. It was not on the nominees, but Tress of the Emerald Sea was. And to me, that makes sense to not have Yumi and Tress there. I did see in the eligibility that authors can have more than one book nominated. You've even seen that for Cassandra Clare, I think, has one for adult and young adult. I know that it could have been there, but I think it would have just taken away from Tress. It being a Princess Bride inspired story also makes it something I could see a lot of people picking up, whether they're big fantasy readers or not, because The Princess Bride is such a well-loved story. So to see sort of a new take on it with a really intense fantasy setting, I think is exciting for a lot of people. So it had the best chance of, I guess you could say it probably has the best chance of winning. It came out earlier in the year. A lot more people have picked it up, and it feels like you really don't need to have read so many other books in the Cosmere. I'm sad because I like Yumi more than Tress, but I am actually kind of weirdly glad that Yumi wasn't on there because I really think that it would have pulled from Tress. I don't know that Tress is my favorite on the list of nominees, but Sanderson's never actually won a Goodreads award. But if Yumi had been there, I definitely think it would have pulled away, and I would have pulled away because I would have been one of those people that would be like, but I liked Yumi more. Next up, we have Thornhedge by T. Kingfisher. This is the one that when I was referencing the eligibility that I was referring to, and there's actually a couple more on this list that fall into this category as well. So within the list of eligibility, there is a release date window that a book has to fall within, which makes sense. There's also an average rating that the book has to at least meet. And Thornhedge is a novella. It's very, very short, and it did not say within the eligibility that books have to be full-length novels, but I didn't see any within the fantasy category. I didn't see any novellas. So it kind of feels like maybe they don't want to have novellas competing against full-length novels. I don't know if that was an intentional thing or if they just didn't think that any of the novellas that came out this year were worth being on the nominees. I'm not really sure. And if I'm mistaken and you know of a novella that was nominated, then feel free to correct me on that. But I kind of get it, because I do think that novellas, there's just such a short amount of time to try and tell a story, and to put that up against a full-length novel does sort of feel unfair. It would be kind of cool if they had a category for short stories and novellas, but I don't believe that they do this year, so it makes sense that this one wouldn't be on there. I did like this one. I don't think it's T. Kingfisher's best, though, so even if they'd had something for novellas, I still could kind of understand this one not being there. I think it feels like a fairy tale. I don't think it feels the most unique or original, because it is kind of a new take on some previous things we've seen. The person locked up in a tower, the person guarding the tower, and it kind of has a mix of Rapunzel and Sleeping Beauty. However, the new elements to it, I think, are much more things that are going to be personal to the reader. So I've said in talking about this book that I felt like a lot of it was a metaphor for what people are willing to blame themselves for, rather than actually placing blame on the people that are committing certain acts that are not decent. And I think a lot of parents will do that when their child does something, their adult child does something that they shouldn't do. People will do that in relationships, whether they be friendships or romantic relationships. And so I think that those themes, while I felt they were present and they were very strong, a lot of people are just going to read this as a fairy tale. And I'm not even saying that I'm right and they won't get it and it's going over their head. I'm just saying that that was my take, but that's not necessarily true and factual, that is the purpose of this book. So I think because it's one where the themes are either very, very hidden or not there and I'm inferring something that's not actually present, I just think that this one, it does result in it feeling a little bit just like a grim fairy tale retelling. After that, we have Immortal Longings. I like this one. I have the very unpopular opinion of liking this one. It feels like nobody likes this, and it feels like the people that dislike it hate it, that they really just have gone... I mean, even when I talked about how I totally understand why other people don't like it, but here's why I liked it, and I did a whole video talking about, has book talk sort of influenced how we view certain books or certain authors and the books that they then put out after gaining a lot of hype on book talk. And some of the comments were like, yeah, but that book sucks. And they were really kind of aggressive in their anger toward the book. And I'm just like, all right, wow. I haven't seen this level of anger toward a book in a while. And I didn't feel that way. I mean, I liked it, but because there were so many people that really didn't care for it, I was not surprised whatsoever that it didn't appear on the list. If you are interested in hearing a little bit more about this one, I'll have that video linked as well as a new releases wrap-up I did so that you can hear a little bit more about the plot and things like that. But yeah, completely made sense that this one wasn't there. I'm pretty alone. After that, we have a book that the last time I checked, the average rating was pretty low. And I don't know if it ended up dipping underneath the eligibility average rating number, but regardless, it was low enough that I'm like, yeah, I'm not surprised that it's not on the list, and that would be The Thorns Remain. While I have seen a lot of anger, like I was saying, about Immortal Longings, this one just kind of quietly hasn't appealed to people. Nobody seemed passionately upset about it, but it just didn't click for a lot of people, and I will say, it is pretty tedious and boring because it's very day to day. You're following a character that lives in a rural area and her friends have been taken by the Fae. And so while trying to get her friends back, she also has to live her life in this rural kind of poor area. And it's historical fantasy, so the day-to-day things I think really transport you to that time and place. However, I completely get people not loving it, finding it that intriguing or that interesting. And then also the Fae elements, while I really liked what the author did with them, and similar to Thornhedge, I pulled a lot from this that maybe isn't necessarily there for everyone. I still also could see people finding the Fae elements to be very been there, done that. So wasn't surprised by that one, just like all the rest of these. I don't really need to say that again. Untethered Sky. So I'll go ahead and group this one with the next one, which is technically Thorn Manor. I don't have Thorn Manor, so I'm going to hold up Sorcery of Thorns. But both of these, once again, would be novellas. So just kind of immediately falling into the camp of, doesn't seem like novellas are nominated, so that makes sense. Also, Untethered Sky, I really liked. Every single time I've talked about it, I believe I've always described it as cinematic. I felt like it did the novella format really well. It told a complete story, I thought, in that amount of time. The ending's a little abrupt, but I really found myself... I could see everything that was being described. I cared about the character. I felt like the amount of time that would be skipped normally would have frustrated me, but in this particular instance, the important details of the story were told in the amount of time and within the time skips. It didn't feel like I was glossing over important information or character development and growth. So I thought that Fondly did a really good job with this one. However, lots of other people have just kind of felt middle of the road on it, and I completely understand because it's hard. I almost always fall into the camp of feeling like novellas don't really say enough for my personal taste, so I can completely relate to that feeling, even though I didn't personally with that book specifically. Thorn Manor is It was super cute. It was really fun to visit these characters again. It was super cozy also. But it's kind of a novella sequel, and you definitely have to have read you have to have read Sorcery of Thorns before picking up Thorn Manor. It didn't feel like its own story because it's relying on you having read Sorcery of Thorns first. It was just kind of a weird thing to get into in the first place. So even though I could have seen this one on the nominees, because I think a lot of people who have picked it up really liked it and would have been happy to have seen it there, it's just such an awkward entry. It also, to me, feels like a transition. I think Margaret Rogerson might end up writing more in this world, and I think we might follow one of the characters that is in Sorcery of Thorns and then in Thorn Manor. I think we might get more with them, and then the main characters in this maybe will be side characters. That's all just a theory. I don't know if that's actually the case, but that's how it felt. It felt like we were kind of just revisiting some characters and having fun, and then maybe alluding to a little bit more at the end. The last one, while I was sad it wasn't there, I'm like, yeah, it wasn't like the best end to a series, and that would be the Bone Shard War. I did like the conclusion. It was not my favorite entry in this trilogy, but I overall felt like the landing stuck. I just wouldn't say that it was the most monumental, exciting, emotional of endings. I was satisfied with it, but I was hoping that this series would be launched into my favorite completed fantasy series of all time by the end, and it didn't quite fit that, but it's still one of my favorites. This just doesn't bump out the top 5. And I think a lot of other people either felt similarly or maybe even a little bit more negative toward this one. It's also the third in a series. I've said in previous years, talking about the Goodreads nominees, that I wish there was some way to do sequels differently. I don't know. I just feel like sequels, it's odd to have them mixed in with first in series. I understand there's a debut category, but there are plenty of people that are writing a sequel, or excuse me, there's plenty of people writing a first in a series where that's not their debut. Anyway, I don't need to go into that whole thing, but Bone Shard War, it was good, but if it had really knocked everybody's socks off, I could see being a little bit more bummed that it wasn't on the list, but I understand. I was sad because I really like the series, and I did like, I'm repeating myself. I'm just going to start talking myself into thinking it was actually truly a snub, and I don't really feel that way, but anyway, that's it for some Goodreads snubs I thought made sense. I hope you have a great rest of your day, though, and I'll see you later. Bye.